I had the opportunity to teach Antonio Gramsci yesterday for my class on 20th century Marxist philosophy, and I want to share one of the things that I consider to be most important from his prison notebook. None of the classics of Marxism, either Marx, Engels, or Lenin, ever really sat down and wrote a refined text about the Marxist understanding of ideology. There's some comments in the early German ideology that Marx and Engels wrote, and in some of the old letters from Engels that suggest an epistemological understanding of ideology. So, ideology as a form of distorted or false consciousness, as a way of inverting the world and placing it on its head. And then there's also a bunch of comments about ideology in a functionalist sense. So, how ideas corresponding to various classes play different social functions for the dominant order. Both understandings of ideology are scattered all throughout the classics, so Marx, Engels, and Lenin. However, given that neither of them was ever able to sit down and just produce one refined, well-edited, and published text on the subject, the different senses in which ideology has been used has been cause for debate in Marxist scholarship. And there's generally two camps: those who look at ideology in a functionalist sense, so ideology has the different functions that collections of ideas and institutions play for society, and those who look at it in an epistemological sense, so the way in which ideology is a way to distort how it is that we view the world. Gramsci, of course, falls more towards the functionalist side of things, and his focus as someone who is leading the Communist Party of Italy and who is trying to figure out the best ways to think and defeat Mussolini's fascism was, how could communists win people over? How can you convince them? And for him, central to this enterprise is realizing that you can't just dismiss the views that people have, the worldview that people have, whether it's a very backwards form of what he called folklore or religion or common sense, all of which belong to what he called the ideological orders. You can't just dismiss those. You have to realize that there's a rational kernel. In common sense, he called it a good sense nucleus. There's something in there that is rational, that is true. And your job as an organizer, as a communist, is to identify that rational kernel, to disarticulate it from the predominant worldview in which it is in, and to begin the process of nurturing it so that you could re-articulate it towards a socialist class consciousness. This is why scholars like Peter Thomas call Antonio Gramsci the theorist of the intellectuals par excellence, because he sees that intellectuals, specifically organic, dissident intellectuals, which are not just people working in the academy, those are the traditional intellectuals. He sees the fundamental task of the socialist intellectual as one of winning the war of positions, the battle of ideas, the battle in the ideological terrain for the consent of the working masses, of the subaltern classes in general. And you can only do this if you're able to connect to the people. If you look down on the people condescendingly, as large parts of the primarily middle class PMC, pre-ACP left in the US did, where they considered the American working class to be too provincial and backwards to even attempt organizing, you're obviously not going to be able to build counter-hegemony, to build working class hegemony, to position yourself as a leading force for the working class movement that can bring them away from this sort of trade union consciousness and towards an actual socialist class consciousness. And for Gramsci, central for this task was not just identifying that good sense nucleus in their thinking, but also doing the same thing at the ethical political level. So at the level of their affects, at the level of their desires, at the level of their passions. So it's about identifying not just what ideas people already hold that implicitly could be developed into an explicit form of socialist class consciousness, but what sort of sentiments, what sort of emotions, what sort of passions, what sort of desires do they hold that we can do the same thing with? This is why, for me, Gramsci is the Gramsci that I, adhere to is not the one that's taught in the Western Academy, the one that's used in all these basically neoliberal post-colonial studies. The Gramsci that I adhere to was a Marxist-Leninist that was trying to figure out concretely what is the best way for communist organizers to win over the working class. Why did the revolutions that were supposed to spread across Western Europe fail? And how do we focus on the war of position, the battle of ideas, so that we can actually win for ourselves a socialist world? And I think that if there is a thinker today that we must actually study directly, it is Antonio Gramsci. If you're interested in reading more about this, I wrote a very in-depth chapter on the subject of Gramsci, intellectuals, ideology, and the ethical political for the Elgers anthology on Antonio Gramsci from, I believe, last year or the year before that. So if you look up my name and you look up Gramsci, you should be able to find it.